everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Hostetter-Habib, and I am currently a senior who has just completed my senior project, which lasted 7 weeks. And I have been researching the AIDS epidemic, and more specifically, how the media, government, and the general public all were silent at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and how that basically prolonged the years in which people continue to be infected, and that is what you're going to hear about today. 357,598 deaths. Out of 573, 800 cases diagnosed within a 15-year span, 398,000 lives were lost, a number bigger than the populations of Pittsburgh, Newark, or Yonkers, all dead within 15 years. And that's not even the end, because as of right now, 36.3 million people have died of AIDS or AIDS-related complications, more than the populations of New York and Pennsylvania combined, and almost the same population as California. Can you even fathom that? HIV and AIDS is not an issue of the past, but it is a tale of which our generation can learn. The AIDS epidemic is a story of sorrow, fear, stigma, and inaction, all of which prolonged the epidemic and caused so many unnecessary deaths. It is a story of how complacency and silence killed. It is how silence equaled death. You may have seen this political poster before. It is often associated with the face of AIDS. Created in 1987 by a group of artists, the Silence Equals Death poster was used by the AIDS Coalition to unleash power, or ACT UP as it's more commonly known, to raise awareness. Using the pink triangle, a symbol associated with the persecution of homosexuals in Nazi Germany, and the phrase silence equals death, the poster declared for that the oppression and annihilation of homosexuals to be stopped. The refusal to dismiss the epidemic or fight for change must end. It is a matter of survival. My research focused on how this phrase, silence equals death, not only talks about the silence of the gay community and its allies to fight for change, but also includes the silence of the media, the government, and general society. The silence of media and news outlets ensured that no information would be passed to the general public, keeping it out of the public's view. Without media coverage, people's ignorance and apathy would continue to fester, because why should they care if it doesn't affect them? Only when HIV and AIDS seemed to seep into the seams of straight society, then did the media cover the issue. Without being reported on, fundraisers for AIDS research, pressure on the government to enact change, and education on preventative measures all were non-existent. The silence of the general public was partly due to the silence of the media, but it was also due to the prevalence of homophobia in society at the time, and the fact that homophobia was accepted. The straight world did not care about the disease because it only affected those that they saw as degenerate or sinful. The disease to many was God's punishment on gay men for their lifestyle. And the silence of the government, that was arguably the most impactful. By seeing AIDS as a political issue, much like at the beginning of the COVID pandemic and somewhat now, politicians refused to even address AIDS for many, many years. In fact, Ronald Reagan only addressed AIDS for the first time in 1987, 6 years after the beginning of the epidemic. The rise of the moral majority, a political association associated with the Christian Right and Republican Party, into power in the 1970s and 1980s ensured that lifestyles other than that was what was deemed normal, so heterosexual, white, and Christian, would be shunned. By not taking action early on, by prioritizing their political agenda over ending a health crisis, the government prolonged the epidemic. Their silence caused the death of hundreds of thousands. So for those of you who don't know what AIDS is, it stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. It is caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV as it's most commonly known, and it becomes AIDS once a patient's helper T cells, which are a type of immune cell, dips below a certain level. At this point, the person who is infected has an increasingly hard time fighting off infections that normally do not cause disease, such as Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia. The latency period for AIDS is anywhere between 4 years to a decade, and it can be delayed by the use of HIV drugs. However, during the 1980s and 1990s, the only real way to prevent infection was through practicing safe sex and universal precautions, as HIV is a bloodborne disease that can also be sexually transmitted. The emergence of the disease. On July 3rd, 1981, Lawrence K. Altman, a physician and medical correspondent, published the first article on AIDS, pulling from information in the CDC's June 5th Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which highlighted the emergence of this new disease. Titled Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals, Altman outlined how doctors in New York and California had diagnosed among homosexual men 41 cases of a rare and often rapidly fatal form of cancer. From the get-go, HIV and AIDS was immediately tied to homosexuality. Before a name was decided on, many reporters would call the disease gay cancer, the gay plague, and GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. However, Altman made sure to state, Dr. Jim Curon, who was a pioneer in AIDS research, said that there was no apparent danger to non-homosexuals from contagion. The best evidence against contagion, he said, is that no cases have been reported to date outside the homosexual community or in women. By enforcing that non-homosexual people would not get AIDS, Altman relieved straight people of concern. As a result, the news did not report on the disease because it was not of concern to who they catered to, the straight middle class. Why disturb the status quo? In fact, NBC anchor Robert Basil said in February of 1983, it would be dishonest not to say we couldn't tell the AIDS story early on because it was about gays. As a part of my project, I conducted interviews to document first-hand accounts of what people went through. In my interview of Alex Habib, one of my fathers who's here right now, he recounted this in part of his interview.
The first few years, it was really a hush-hush thing because no one really wanted to talk about it for various reasons. It was once people realized that the ones that are being impacted was the LGBTQ plus community, that didn't resonate well on any level with anyone, really. The government didn't know what to do with that. They didn't want to address it because, for fears of how that would look to a particular politician, depending on what side they were leaning, whether liberal or conservative. The churches didn't know what to do with it because of the stand of perception of what the Bible said about it. And the gay community was just starting to make strides in equality, so they didn't really want to talk about it because they were afraid that that would set back the progress that was made up to that point. So it was a very difficult, very confusing, and very hurtful time. And that's what I meant when I said that it was sad, unnecessary death, because had people focused on the actual disease, it may have been eradicated or stopped, or maybe finding solutions faster than they could.
As Alex said, nothing was being done. The first nightly news broadcast of AIDS wasn't even until a year after the first mention of the disease, despite it infecting hundreds of people by this time. May of 1983, though, that all changed. Most of you know Dr. Anthony Fauci as the white knight who took on the crusade of flattening the curve in the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the 1980s, he was an immunologist researching AIDS. In 1983, he wrote a report raising the question of if AIDS could be transmitted through casual contact. He wrote, perhaps even more importantly is the possibility that routine close contact, as within a family household, can spread the disease. If, indeed, the latter is true, then AIDS takes on an entirely new dimension. Despite it just being a theory, the masses went into a frenzy of panic and hysteria. As you can see in the graph taken from one of the papers I read, there was an extreme spike in the amount of night network news reports happening in the summer of '83 in the months following the report. This false alarm enabled misinformation and confusion to become rampant in society. Everywhere you turned, there was fear, as described by an anonymous interviewee.
Being a trainer, and because I had medical background, I became the guy for 400, mostly men, but some women, 400 men to impart rational, scientific information about AIDS, and to keep people from panicking, and to keep people from I can't think of the right word, but to mistreat or to mistreat people who they suspected of having AIDS, or because they were afraid of the virus. So this was a time where you could find, you would have seen people dressed up in like you would see for COVID, you know, that version, masks and gloves, and people were afraid They were afraid to shake somebody's hand if they thought they had AIDS. And they were certainly afraid of gay people because it was thought of as a gay disease.
Along with the physical ostracizing of those with AIDS, gay men were also subject to stigmatization due to popular rhetoric and lack of empathy. According to a poll conducted by ABC and the Washington Post, only 3% of the 1,000 people surveyed said they personally knew someone with AIDS. This lack of empathy, this lack of connection meant that it was easier to stigmatize, ridicule, and blame gay men because many were not forced to challenge their own prejudices. Gay men and IV drug users were seen as sinners, degenerates, and people who were deserving of AIDS. But those like hemophiliacs, particularly hemophiliac children, were seen as the innocent, people being corrupted by the guilty. These sentiments are described in the next few interview clips.
There was also a sense that there were innocent victims of AIDS and not innocent victims of AIDS, right? I'm sure you can figure out who this were, but like, Ryan White is an innocent victim of AIDS. Gay people did it to themselves. And like, there was I remember being very aware of that media dichotomy. Like this innocent child didn't do anything and everybody else infected him versus like huge swath. And it wasn't just gay men, right? It was also people of color and intravenous drug users and like all these marginalized communities. And it's like, well, they did it to themselves. You can't have it both ways. That's not how it works.
And so it felt like, you know, there was this terrible message during those years of like HIV is God's punishment for gays, right? But there was a certain way, and it felt like it was like this it was like the universe punishing him for the audacity of being himself and the audacity of like loving the people he wanted to love. And so it felt like incredibly brutal emotionally because of all of that. And there was, you know, the tremendous unfairness of living in a society in which you're not accepted for who you are, and then your health is not treated as equally important, and as the basis for like public policy in the way, again, that we saw with COVID. It was like, okay, we have to deal with this because and it took forever for there to be, you know, real mainstream recognition that HIV/AIDS wasn't just sort of like something that only affects, you know, one community.
Despite confusion, misinformation, and stigma spreading like wildfire, there was a silver lining to AIDS hysteria. It allowed for more people to learn about the epidemic, putting the first pressures on the government to respond to the crisis. Within a month, from June to July of 1983, the amount of people who said that they've heard about AIDS went from 77% to 91%. Additionally, on a federal level, the House of Representatives held a hearing to discuss potential federal involvement to combat the crisis, and President Reagan had his first 2 meetings to discuss AIDS. After those 2 meetings, though, Reagan did not hold another meeting discussing the crisis until the summer of 1985, the moment when everything changed. Rock Hudson's announcement that he had AIDS. Rock Hudson was one of the most well-known actors of his time, his career spanning more than 3 decades. In my mind, Rock Hudson is probably most comparable to Leonardo DiCaprio. He's known for his good looks when he was young, and he began his career being featured in film magazines and eventually working his way up to the top to starring in adventure and romantic dramas. The epitome of masculinity, many saw him as the ideal man. He had good looks, strength, a daring personality, while also being romantic and sincere. Everything about him conveyed heterosexual, clean-cut, perfect. So, of course, when Hudson disclosed that he was recovering in Paris due to an unknown cancer on July 23rd, 1985, it sent the whole world buzzing. Everyone knew that he had AIDS, and on July 25th, his diagnosis of AIDS was confirmed.
As we told you at the top of the show, actor Rock Hudson has AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Groups such as the National Gay Task Force are hoping the actor's high visibility will promote new understanding of this disease, just as President Reagan's cancer focused new attention on colorectal cancer. The news of Hudson's illness was revealed in Paris Thursday. CNN's Don Lennox has more.
Through his diagnosis, Rock Hudson changed the face of AIDS by legitimizing the disease as a concern for all. It forced people to realize that AIDS affects everyone, not just those they deem lesser than. As CBS anchor Dan Rather said on a Rock Hudson segment, it's not at all what people first thought, a mysterious killer that seemed to strike beyond the bounds of respectable society. People thought AIDS was something you caught in alleyways from a dirty needle or picked up in gay haunts doing things most people don't do. But now science knows it is a deadly virus that makes no moral or sexual distinctions, and it's making its way very slowly toward Main Street. Due to the looming danger of the disease to the heterosexual community, media reporting soared, changing how the world saw AIDS forever. For example, in June 1985, a month before Rock Hudson's diagnosis came out, the New York Times only carried 4 articles on AIDS. This changed to 16 articles in July, keeping in mind that his diagnosis only came out a week before the end of the month, 42 in August, and 72 in September. Likewise, in 1985, evening newscasts on major networks aired about 20 stories per month on AIDS, and in a survey of about 1,000 people, 72% reported hearing about or reading 3 or more stories about AIDS in the last 7 days. With the increase in media, the general public's concern about AIDS grew, as outlined by Bruce Ward, who was working at an AIDS hotline during this time.
That is very, very interesting, actually, because the people I've interviewed haven't really mentioned Rock Hudson and the shift in public perception, so thank you for mentioning that.
Sure. I mean, I really just noticed it because I was working there at the hotline, and I noticed the change in the phones ringing, and the questions that we had. And again, it's one of the columns, but this is before personal computers, and we did everything by hand. We mimeographed sheets in front of us with pencils and phones with cords, and the majority of the calls we had to mark down, different categories of calls as we were on the phone, and the majority of them were what we called the worried well. That was the category, the worried well, which meant basically people who were not at risk. A lot of heterosexuals calling about. I kept a list of some of the more interesting calls. I mean, everything from mosquitoes to swimming pools to outrageous scenarios, like a woman calling about. I was in an apartment in the West Village that I was interested in buying, but I saw something that looked like dried blood on the radiator. Maybe a gay man lived here. Could I get AIDS? Things like that. And
with the disease on their mind, the public wanted answers. They wanted action. The public was finally starting to make noise and pressure the government. The next move belonged to Reagan, and the nation was holding their breath to see what he would do. Initially, as a response to the increasing pressure, Reagan commissioned Surgeon General C. Everett Koop to write a report on AIDS in December 1985. Given the position of Surgeon General due to his pro-life stances and dedication to Christianity, upper admin officials thought Koop would emphasize AIDS education in the context of heterosexual marriage, religious conservatism, and homosexuality as a sin. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Published in 1987, Koop's report prioritized objectivity over achieving a political agenda, writing in his editorial, controversial and sensitive issues are inherent in the subject of AIDS, and these issues are addressed in my report. Value judgments are absent. This is an objective health and medical report. To the chagrin of other admin officials, Koop did not condemn homosexuality or sex outside of wedlock, especially in the context of homosexual relations. In fact, he wrote, AIDS should not be used as an excuse to discriminate against any group or individual. He stressed the importance of action by the government and the implementation of AIDS education in schools, with a focus on condom usage, and even included contact information to gay organizations such as the National Gay Task Force and the Gay Men's Health Crisis at the end of his report. He stressed empathy, addressed taboo subjects, and dispelled myths about transmission methods. All in all, Koop did the exact opposite of what other Republicans wanted him to do. As ABC reported on October 22, 1986, Surgeon General C. Everett Koop broke the publicly united front of the government through his report, and the public wanted answers. They wanted to know where the president stood, with Koop and the CDC or with his fellow party members. Finally, on April 1, 1987, Reagan shared his sentiments to the world on AIDS in an official speech for the first time. But just like the fracturing of his administration, he was full of contradictory opinions and tension. In his speech to the College of Physicians in Philadelphia, his first speech, he announced that funding for AIDS would increase to $1 billion, but also talked about how he would not implement a cost containment system for those racking up medical bills for AIDS treatment. He acknowledged the increasing priority of AIDS and finding treatment, but contradictingly, he also refused to help those suffering, primarily the poor, by lessening the economic burden of healthcare. Likewise, in his speech at the American Foundation for AIDS Research Awards dinner on May 31st, 1987, he stressed that AIDS is a disease that affects everyone, not just gay men, and that compassion must be employed, while also announcing that immigrants who are HIV positive would be barred from moving to the States. Despite his conflicting messages, Reagan did in fact create a commission to deal with the AIDS epidemic the summer of 1987. Formerly known as the President's Commission on the HIV Epidemic, the commission consisted of mostly doctors, including a gay geneticist. Without a doubt, creating this showed presidential leadership on the AIDS epidemic, something the previous 6 years had lacked. As a result, AIDS entered the political agenda as a permanent matter, ensuring that the media reported on it continuously. It was no longer subject to fluctuations as it had been in the past. The peak of coverage was actually in 1987, topping in at over 5,000 stories. The silence had been broken, yes, but it was too late. The initial silence already had started to take its toll. By the time Reagan created the AIDS Commission, over 13,000 individuals had already passed away, with over 1.5 million others believed to have already been exposed to AIDS, and the yearly death toll was only increasing from there. The impacts were palpable, grief was everywhere, and there was no escape. Despite the increase in attention, those with AIDS were still being stigmatized, being ostracized. It was truly a dark age for this nation, as you'll hear about in the next few clips.
So I think there's a physical component to it, but there's also an emotional, psychological trauma that's associated with it from all the deaths we've experienced and from our own sort of loss of life. Mm-hmm. I kept a list of people I knew who died. There were 96 of them. Friends, colleagues, one relative. I may be a little unusual in that because I worked in the field, so I knew a lot of people, a lot of people who were obviously had AIDS, people positive. I came in contact with and was working with, they were colleagues of mine, or they were clients of mine, so, I knew a lot of people. But dealing with all the death of people so young, in their 20s and 30s, sort of all at once, within a number of years, within a decade.
96 people died that he knew. That is more than 2/3 of your grade.
But there's one girl that I had in particular, and her mother was in the hospital dying. Actually, both of her parents were dying one after the other. But it was her mother's impending death, because she had just lost her father. It was just really, really getting to her, because I think she realized that she would then be an orphan. And, I asked her, well, if you had one wish, what would it be? And her birthday was coming up, and she was like, she really wanted to be able to celebrate her birthday with her family. And it prompted me, I didn't bake her a birthday cake, but I baked her some cookies, because I thought she needed some homemade love. And I also then asked her if it would be okay if I visited her mother in the hospital, if her mother had visitors. And so I did. I went to the hospital, and just seeing the struggle to live and having a chance to talk to her mother about how her daughter was doing in school. And I'm gonna get weepy because it did something to me. It made me realize that it was not an abstract disease that affected other people, that I was part of a community that was being impacted.
People were dying every day. Loved ones were dying every day. Because of the government's inaction and refusal to implement AIDS prevention education programs at the beginning, people continued to be infected, and it was now catching up. Tens of thousands of people were sick without getting proper care and were suffering. The gay community became angry of being silenced. And thus, the ACT UP, one of the most well-known and influential organizations dedicated to combating the AIDS epidemic, was born. Founded in March of 1987, ACT UP aimed to restructure the public and governmental conception of AIDS, intervene at specific junctures to ensure that AIDS was not ignored, and empower persons with AIDS by raising their own consciousness and sense of power. Unlike their previous counterparts, ACT UP was more assertive and dramatic because the leaders knew that that was the only way to get media coverage. And it worked. Through their staged die-ins and protests, ACT UP successfully got change to occur. And it wasn't just a one-time occurrence. By continuously getting media attention, they put pressure on different organizations and the government to enact change to better the lives of those affected by AIDS. The culmination of ACT UP's efforts is best shown through their first national FDA protest, known as Seize Control of the FDA. With over 1,500 activists descending on the FDA headquarters in Rockville, Maryland, they protested the lengthy drug approval process. At this time, on average, it took the FDA 10 to 12 years to approve a drug for usage. But with the emergence of AZT, the first drug found to prolong the onset of AIDS, it was a matter of life or death whether or not people got access to treatment. AIDS patients did not have a decade to spare. They needed immediate action. Although the approval time for AZT was significantly reduced, ACT UP ensured that all future HIV drugs could be approved speedily by staging Seize Control of the FDA, because within 2 weeks of the protest, the agency changed its regulations to allow for a shortened approval process. Along with providing substantial change for those living with HIV and AIDS, ACT UP provided community to those who had been ostracized. It gave them an outlet for their anger and their sadness, but most importantly, it gave the silenced a voice. It allowed the oppressed to see that their voices were powerful and that they could enact change if they made noise. It made them see that silence equals death, and they could no longer be complacent in a system that was actively working against them.
We were doomed. We were living as a doomed people. And this was not having that be the dominant narrative, our dominant narrative. We were going to fight back, fight hate. You know, how you even, the audacity to fight a disease as faggots who had been bullied just all our lives. There was so much chutzpah in that. And I needed that. And it's definitely made me, turned me from, what was I before, it turned me into a fighter.
Due to the efforts of ACT UP, the newfound commitment to preventing the spread of AIDS by the government, and the newfound commitment of preventing AIDS by the government, the 1990s were a period of change. For one, the early association of AIDS with homosexuality was undermined because in 1992, the amount of cases who were infected of gay men dropped from 90% of all cases to 55% of cases. Additionally, on a federal level, Congress, due to the fact that it became unified in 1987 and started passing more bills targeting HIV and AIDS. This includes the Ryan White Act, in which Congress approved a $2.9 billion spending plan to assist those living with AIDS, and unfortunately that was compromised due to budgeting issues. But it also passed the Americans with Disability Act, extending its anti-discrimination policies to include people with HIV and AIDS-related complexes and AIDS. And most fortunately, 1996 saw the groundbreaking development of protease inhibitors and combination therapy, which was the first non-toxic sustained therapy to treat those with HIV. It changed the course of HIV and AIDS forever by inhibiting protease. HIV cells are unable to self-replicate, ensuring that the virus cannot weaken the immune system any further and essentially putting the disease into remission. Protease inhibitors and combination therapy drastically mitigated the harm that HIV and AIDS could cause. Compared to the 6-month period of July to December of 1995, where 22,332 people were reported to have died from AIDS, only 7,438 people passed away in the same amount of time just a year later. Instead of HIV or AIDS diagnosis being a death sentence, people could now live with HIV or AIDS. Combination therapy and protease inhibitors gave those who were HIV positive a second chance at life, at the point where in today's society, those who are HIV positive can live just as long as someone who is seronegative. But it is undeniable the initial silence of the gay community, the general public, and the media, and the government all contributed to the incomprehensible death toll of the AIDS epidemic. By not speaking up sooner, by remaining silent, the gay community, IV drug users, and other minority communities all suffered as a preventable disease ravaged through their lives. By the time the silence was broken, it was too late. The damage had already been done. It cost the lives of 357,598 individuals within just 15 years. If action had been taken sooner, particularly preventative measures, that number could have been less if the U.S. responded to the AIDS medical crisis and not as a medical crisis and not a political issue. Silence truly equaled death. Although reflecting on the detrimental effects silence caused during the AIDS epidemic, this silence is not an issue of the past, though. In 2018, 41 anti-queer bills were introduced. In 22 so far, over 300 bills have been introduced. 300 bills. Legislators around the country are trying to criminalize trans kids from accessing gender-affirming and life-saving health care. According to a study done by researchers at the University of Washington in Seattle, those who initiated hormone blockers and gender-affirming hormones were 73% less likely to have suicidal thoughts compared to trans kids who didn't have access to such treatments. The Don't Say Gay bill in Florida would have prohibited me from talking about my family because legislators believe that parents should have the right to control when LGBTQ+ issues are introduced to their kids. But let me ask you, are LGBTQ+ issues inherently immoral, that they're able to corrupt children? This is the same rhetoric that was being used during the AIDS epidemic. Gayness is being seen as a pollution that is able to taint the innocent. Yet look at me, I turned out pretty all right despite growing with 2 dads. The queer community is being attacked. We are being silenced just as we were during the AIDS epidemic. If you learn anything from this presentation, it should be that silence and complacency never turn out well. Silence costs lives. Silence equals death. Speak out for injustices you see in the world, even if they do not personally affect you. Take the time to educate yourself on issues that affect those whose voices are often silenced. If you want to know what you can do for the queer community now, let me tell you it goes beyond signing petitions, although that is a major part of it. It is using someone's correct pronouns, their correct name. It is speaking out against jokes where being gay is at the core of them. And let me tell you, being here at this school for 14 years, I know the jokes, I know the side comments, I know the comments made without thinking about their impact. They're isolating, they are demeaning, and they are dehumanizing. Challenge the status quo. Do not be complacent. Do not be silent, and above anything else, be kind. Be kind always. Thank you to everyone who helped me with this project, particularly Dr. Evie, Ms. Ross, and my project advisor, Ms. Zimmerman. Thank you to all my interviewees, and thank you to Maya, Leah, and Lonnie for helping me transcribe the interviews, which definitely provided me a lot of ease of mind. And thank you to everyone else who made this possible. If you would like to check out the interviews or find out more information about my project, go to aidshistories.org. Thank you so much for listening.